Welcome back, deep divers. Today we're diving into the fascinating world of voting behavior, and we're focusing on India, a country with a democracy as vibrant and diverse as its population.
It's going to be quite a journey, exploring the forces that shape elections, whether you're a UPSC aspirant analyzing political trends or just a curious citizen trying to understand this complex landscape.
Exactly, and we're going beyond just counting votes. We're going to decode the why behind those choices.
Absolutely. You know, it's funny, voting behavior even has a fancy Greek name, psephology.
Sophology, I like it. So why is understanding the why so crucial?
Well, think of it this way. Imagine you're a detective at a crime scene. You see the evidence, but to crack the case, you need to understand the motives.
Okay, I get it. It's about understanding the forces that drive those decisions.
Precisely. Studying voting behavior helps us understand how individuals form their political beliefs. Like, did those beliefs come from childhood dinner table conversations about politics or maybe from a major life event? This process is called political socialization.
Ah, so it's not like we're just born with our political leanings. It's a journey shaped by our experiences.
Exactly. And by understanding that journey, we can get a sense of how deeply democratic values are rooted in a society. Are people making informed choices or are there other factors at play?
It's like we're asking, are people voting based on critical thinking, or are they being swayed by something else?
Right. And then there's the power of the ballot box itself. It can be revolutionary, but studying voting behavior helps us understand those power dynamics. Is it a genuine transfer of power, or are there unseen forces at work?
But I'm starting to see why this topic is so fascinating. It's like a key to understanding how power really functions in a democracy, especially in a country as complex as India.
You got it. And it helps us see if elections are bringing about real change or simply reinforcing existing power structures, especially in a place like India where societal influences run deep.
So let's talk about those influences. From my reading, it seems like there's a whole mix of factors at play in how Indians vote.
You're absolutely right. It's like a recipe with a ton of ingredients. You've got social structures, personal beliefs, political strategies, and even money, sadly, gets thrown into the mix.
Wow, that's a lot to digest. Maybe we can start with what we've been calling socio-economic factors. And we have to talk about caste. I came across this quote by Ravni Kathori that really struck me. He said, and I'm quoting here, Indian politics is casteist and caste is politicized.
It's a pretty powerful statement.
It is, and it reflects a reality that's been present in India for a long time. Caste loyalties can definitely influence voting, especially at the local level.
So even though India is a modern democracy, these traditional social structures still have a stronghold.
They do. Paul Brass, a scholar of Indian politics, found that in many constituencies, dominant castes will often vote as a bloc, supporting a candidate from their own caste or a party that aligns with their interests.
Interesting. It's like identity politics, but with deep historical roots.
Exactly. And religion is another powerful factor, despite India being a constitutionally secular country. Yeah, we see that with the presence of communal parties that appeal directly to religious sentiments.
Right. And then there's influence of language and region. India is incredibly diverse linguistically and culturally, and these identities often shape voting choices. That's one of the reasons why we've seen the rise of so many regional parties championing the interests of specific linguistic or regional groups.
It's almost like having these mini elections within the larger national election, with all these different identities vying for representation.
A great way to put it. And let's not forget the power of personality. India has a history of charismatic leaders. Figures like Nehru, Indira Gandhi, and even more recently Modi, who've significantly influenced voting patterns.
Yeah, it's remarkable how a single individual can have such a massive ripple effect across the political landscape.
It really is. But of course, we also have to acknowledge the less glamorous side of things. Money, unfortunately, plays a big role despite efforts to regulate campaign financing.
It's sad, but true. I mean, we even have a phrase for it, votes for notes, implying that voters are being essentially bribed for their vote.
It's a problem, for sure. But it's important to understand all sides of this, even the unsavory parts.
Absolutely. But I've also read about wave elections, where national issues or a particularly charismatic leader, like we just mentioned, can actually override these local dynamics, even the influence of money.
You're right. Paul Brass, who we mentioned earlier, describes wave elections as moments when a single issue or a powerful personality captures the imagination of voters across the country, transcending those typical voting patterns.
So it's not always a predictable game. There can be these massive shifts in the political landscape.
Exactly. But moving beyond these social and economic influences, there's another set of factors we need to consider, the purely political ones.
Okay, let's delve into those. What kinds of things are voters weighing from a strictly political standpoint?
Well, one of the biggest factors is the performance of the ruling party. Voters tend to assess whether the current government has delivered on its promises. Have their lives actually improved? This can lead to something we call the anti-incumbency factor, where voters express their dissatisfaction by voting against the current government.
It's like a report card for the people in power.
Exactly. And then there's party identification, which is that feeling of emotional connection that some voters might have to a particular political party. This was a really strong factor in the decades after India's independence, but it's declined somewhat since the 1970s.
So maybe there's been a shift toward a more issue-based or candidate-focused style of voting.
That's a possibility. And then there's ideology, though it might not play as big a role as you'd think. While some voters are very committed to ideologies like communism or capitalism, the number of people driven solely by ideology is relatively small.
So it's not always about following a rigid ideological script.
Right. And then you have this whole array of other factors that come into play. Things like major political events, how the economy is doing, even infighting within parties.
And let's not forget all the demographic factors. Age, gender, education, urban versus rural. It's a long list.
It is. And each of these factors adds another layer of complexity to the puzzle of voting behavior.
We've covered a lot of ground already, and it's clear that understanding voting behavior in India is like peeling back the layers of an onion. But we can't move on without talking about one more key player, the media.
Absolutely. The media plays an enormous role in shaping perceptions and influencing choices, like a spotlight shining on the electoral process.
But that spotlight can illuminate both the good and the bad, right? It can expose wrongdoing, but it can also be used to mislead people.
For sure. It's a powerful tool that can be used in many ways.
So let's talk about that. Let's unpack this multifaceted role of the media in Indian elections.
Okay, let's start with the basics. Information dissemination. The media acts as a crucial source of information for citizens, keeping them informed about how the election works, who the candidates are, and what's happening throughout the campaign.
Yeah, it's like a vital link between the voters and the whole electoral process.
Right. And it helps to increase transparency. For instance, the media often publicizes information from candidate affidavits, which are sworn statements about their background and finances.
That's a good point. So it's not just about informing voters, it's also about making sure things are transparent and accountable.
Exactly. And that leads us to the media's watchdog role, which is absolutely essential in a democracy. They can bring to light any violations of the Model Code of Conduct, which sets rules for how parties and candidates should behave during the election.
It's like they're the guardians of fair play, making sure everyone's following the rules.
Right. They can expose hate speech, unethical campaigning, any attempts to manipulate the process. It's a crucial function.
Like they're the referees, keeping things honest.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that the media itself has to operate within certain boundaries, especially during elections.
Right, like those restrictions on publishing exit polls or broadcasting certain types of election-related content in the lead-up to voting.
Yes, exactly. Those rules are there to prevent the media from unduly influencing voters in the final hours before and during the election.
So it's a balancing act, right? Making sure the media can inform and scrutinize without stepping over the line into manipulation.
Absolutely. And there's another important role we need to talk about: voter education and encouraging participation.
Right. Especially reaching out to those who may not be as engaged or informed, like first-time voters, young people, or those in rural communities.
Precisely. The media can play a crucial role in bridging that information gap and motivating people to get involved.
And this brings up the responsibility of government-run media, like Doordarshan and All India Radio.
Right. They have a special obligation to remain neutral, ensure a level playing field for all parties and candidates, and really prioritize voter awareness.
So it's all about making sure that everyone has access to accurate, unbiased information so they can make informed choices.
That's the foundation of a healthy democracy. Now, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've covered so far. We explored a whole range of factors that can influence how people vote in India, from the longstanding impact of caste and religion to the appeal of charismatic leaders, and yes, even the unfortunate influence of money.
It's been quite a journey so far. And for our UPSC aspirants out there, this is a gold mine of insights you can use to answer those tough questions about Indian politics and society. But for those of us who aren't prepping for exams, what's the key takeaway here? What's the big picture?
What strikes me is the sheer complexity of voting behavior in India. There's no single easy answer to why people vote the way they do. It's this dynamic mix of multiple factors, some pushing in one direction, some pulling in another.
So are there any patterns or trends emerging from all this data? Anything that can help us make sense of this complexity?
Well, one thing that stands out is a gradual shift away from those more traditional influences like caste and religion, and a move towards what we call performance-based voting. It seems like people are increasingly holding governments accountable for their actions and their promises.
So it's not just about blind loyalty anymore. Voters are getting more demanding, more discerning.
It seems that way, and it's actually encouraging for Indian democracy. It suggests a maturing electorate, one that's actively engaged in holding their leaders accountable.
But we can't forget that money and muscle power still play a role.
Right. Unfortunately, that's true. These are challenges that Indian democracy is still wrestling with. But the growing awareness of these issues, thanks in part to the media, is a positive sign.
So it's a mixed bag, but it sounds like there's a sense of progress, of evolution.
I think that's a fair assessment. And for our UPSC aspirants, grasping these nuances of voting behavior is key to understanding the broader dynamics of Indian politics and society.
It's about connecting the dots, seeing those bigger patterns, and analyzing the forces that are shaping this vibrant democracy.
Well put. And for everyone listening, whether you're studying for an exam or just curious about the world, understanding voting behavior is like having a secret decoder ring for political events. It helps you see the why behind the what.
Absolutely. It's about looking beyond the headlines and really understanding the motivations and aspirations that drive those choices at the ballot box.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Now, as we wrap up this first part of our deep dive, I can't help but wonder.
With all these factors swirling around, are we headed for a future where voters are swayed by algorithms and online ads?
That's a great question. How will technology reshape this complex dance of influences, especially in a country like India, which is right at the forefront of the digital revolution? Think about it. The rise of social media, smartphones practically everywhere you look, the potential for AI to target voters with incredible precision. It's like we're entering a whole new world where the old rules might not apply anymore.
So are we saying goodbye to those huge rallies and the door-to-door campaigning? Will elections become all about who can run the slickest online campaign?
Well, it's probably not that straightforward. While digital tools are definitely going to become even more important, I don't think we can discount the power of those face-to-face interactions, especially in a country like India, where personal connections still carry a lot of weight.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's not like one replaces the other. It's more about how those new digital tools are going to interact with that existing social and political landscape.
Right, and that's what makes this such a fascinating time to study voting behavior, especially in India, which is, like you said, at the leading edge of this digital revolution.
I bet this is gold for our UPSC aspirants. It's not just about knowing the history. It's about being able to imagine how these trends might play out in the future.
Absolutely. Just imagine being asked to analyze the potential impact of social media on voting behavior in the next election. Understanding those dynamics can make all the difference in crafting a really insightful answer.
It's about connecting the dots, anticipating the curveballs, and really demonstrating that deep understanding of how technology is changing the political landscape.
Exactly. And as we've already discussed, voting behavior is influenced by this really complex web of factors. So for those preparing for the UPSC exam, it's crucial to remember that this is about more than just remembering facts and figures. It's about being able to understand how all those different pieces of the puzzle fit together, and then being able to analyze how they might shape actual political outcomes.
Like putting together a puzzle where the pieces are constantly changing shape, you need to be able to think analytically and see the bigger picture.
And speaking of the bigger picture, before we wrap up completely, I wanted to circle back to the role of the media in all of this. We talked about the media's role in informing the public and holding those in power accountable, but there's another layer we need to consider.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more.
Well, think about how the media, especially in this age of social media, can amplify certain voices and narratives while others get drowned out. And that can have a huge impact on how people see the candidates, the issues, and even how they view democracy itself.
That's a really important point. It's not just about what information is out there, but it's also about whose voices are being heard and whose voices are being silenced.
Exactly. And for our UPSC aspirants, this brings up some interesting questions. How do we ensure that we have a media landscape that's both free and fair? What are the ethical implications of things like algorithms that shape what we see and hear online?
Wow, those are questions that go way beyond any one exam. They're fundamental to a healthy democracy, really.
Absolutely. And they require a deep understanding not just of how voting behavior works, but also the values and principles that underpin a truly democratic society.
This has been a really insightful deep dive. We've gone from those historical roots of voting behavior in India all the way to a potential future shaped by technology, and we've explored all those complexities of media influence along the way.
And hopefully we've equipped our listeners, especially those UPSC aspirants out there, with some valuable knowledge that will help them make sense of this intricate world.
But before we sign off, I want to leave everyone with one last thought. We spent all this time talking about voting behavior, but how do we become more informed and discerning voters ourselves? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the information out there, the social pressures, the narratives we're constantly bombarded with.
That's such an important question, and it's something we should all be thinking about, whether we're preparing for exams or simply trying to be engaged citizens. I think the first step is really recognizing that we're all susceptible to those influences. None of us are immune to the biases and assumptions we've picked up from our families, our communities, the media we consume.
So step one is self-awareness, recognizing that we all come to the table with those preconceived notions.
Yes, once we realize that, then we can start to question those assumptions. We can seek out different perspectives. We can engage in respectful conversations with people who hold different views and be open to changing our minds when we encounter new information.
It's about being open to learning and growing, not just sticking to our own tribe and refusing to budge, right?
Exactly. And this is where critical thinking comes in. We're all just inundated with information, especially online. So learning to evaluate those sources, spot those biases, and being able to distinguish fact from fiction is so important for anyone who wants to be an informed voter.
It's like we all need to develop that internal BS detector,
Right.
especially when it comes to all the information we encounter online.
I love that. And don't forget to go beyond just those headlines. Really dig into the issues, look at them from multiple perspectives, and consider what those long-term consequences might be. Our choices at the ballot box can really shape the kind of future we end up with.
It's about recognizing that our vote isn't just a mark on a piece of paper. It's a powerful tool that we can use to create the kind of world we want to live in.
Well said. And being an informed voter isn't a one-time thing. It's a constant process of learning, reflecting, and engaging with everything that's going on around us.
So true. It's like a muscle that needs to be exercised regularly.
Well, this deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about, and I hope our listeners feel the same way. We've covered so much ground, from the historical roots of voting behavior in India all the way to that potential future shaped by technology. And of course, we unpacked all those complexities of media influence along the way.
And hopefully we've empowered our listeners to become more informed, more discerning voters, to approach that democratic process with a critical eye and a real sense of purpose. If this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, remember, this is just the beginning. Keep asking those insightful questions, keep exploring those different perspectives, and keep diving deep into those issues that matter most to you. That's what the deep dive is all about. It really is. It's like a muscle that we need to keep exercising if we want it to be strong, right?
Exactly. Well, this deep dive has certainly given me a lot to think about, and I hope our listeners feel the same way. We started by tracing those historical roots of voting behavior in India, and then we jumped ahead to explore that potential future shaped by technology. And of course, we had to unpack all those complexities of how the media influences everything along the way.
It's been a pretty incredible journey, honestly.
It really has. And I hope we've empowered our listeners, especially those UPSC aspirants, to approach that whole democratic process with a more critical eye and with a real sense of purpose, to become more informed and more discerning voters.
If this deep dive has piqued your curiosity, remember this is just the start. Keep asking those insightful questions. Keep exploring all those different viewpoints. And most importantly, keep diving deep into those issues that matter most to you. That's what the deep dive is all about.